Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on the early modern papacy. We left off last time with the death of Pope Marcellus Pope Marcellus II on May 1st, 1555. The pendulum effect is what we will witness next. It is inescapable in the human condition. Action precipitates equal and opposite reaction. Extreme action triggers extreme opposing reaction. So what happened next was inevitable. Just as Renaissance humanism produced one of the worst popes in Alexander VI, worst in the sense of being flagrantly immoral, multiple illegitimate children, etc. So also, it would produce the exact opposite, a pope of extreme asceticism and severity. That man was Gian Pietro Carafa, elected as Pope 223 by the Second Conclave of 1555 on the 23rd of May to succeed Pope Marcellus II. He ruled under the papal name Paul IV for 4 years and 3 months. Carafa was born near Benevento in the territory of Naples in southern Italy on the 28th of June, 1476. He was born into the local aristocracy. He was a gifted child with a prodigious memory. Early in life, he achieved complete fluency in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. His aptitude for languages drew him to the humanist movement. His birth into the aristocracy gave him automatic welcome into the highest levels of society, and his natural talent brought him to the attention of the church. Carafa was ordained Bishop of Chieti in 1505. That's spelled Chieti. But for reasons that we will see, it is better known by its by the Latin rendering of that name, Theate, Theate. He was used as one of the feudalism problems is that as a bishop he was not allowed to stay in his diocese, even though he was one that would have wanted to. He was his language abilities and his aristocratic birth made him an ideal candidate from the perspective of the Holy See to use on diplomatic missions. So that's what happened to him. And for years, he was away from his diocese, fulfilling these missions to England, Flanders, and Spain. He was an ardent Neapolitan nationalist in the sense that you remember, as far back as the medieval course, Naples had at times been an independent kingdom. And as he was an aristocrat, born an aristocrat in Naples, he thought that was the proper order of things. Well, in his time, that was not the case, because the Kingdom of Naples had been seized by Spain. Essentially, it was a colony, a European colony of Spain. So this state of affairs filled him with hatred for Spain. Which is because Spain. Well, anyway, okay. So you get them. He was also passionate for the reform of the church. In his early days, he was certain that the best of humanism, meaning the best of the Renaissance, which for him meant scholarship, could be used in service of reforming the church. So he was on his way as a young man to being a Renaissance-type prelate. Two things happened to change his attitude. First was what turned out to be a 5-year appointment as papal nuncio to Flanders in Spain from 1515 to 1520. Flanders, it's a geographical expression from the period that referred to an area with different boundaries, but it corresponded more or less to what is now the Netherlands and Belgium. And Spain, well, of course, you know where Spain is. In Flanders, he came into contact with the Northern European version of humanism, which was far more radical than what he had known in southern Italy. He saw that Dutch humanists were using their scholarship as a means of ridiculing the church, particularly parish priests who had not had the opportunity to receive the education that the pampered children of aristocrats and wealthy merchants had enjoyed, and therefore were unable to debate them on an equal footing. Carafa's travels in Spain, his assignment in Spain as nuncio, entailed dealing with the most political elements of the government. He came away from those meetings revolted at the naked, grasping, predatory attitude of some of these secular government officials that they had toward the church. Even though Spain was officially a Catholic monarchy, it was in this period, in the imperialist phase of its history, the expansionist phase, colonial phase. So this experience reinforced his already existent anti-Spanish prejudice that he had grown up with in Naples, as the Spanish officials with whom he had to transact business took for granted Spain's right to control Naples. These 5 years, to put it another way, put Carafa, the future Pope Paul IV, into contact with the worst elements of humanism and of Spanish colonialism. This shaped his attitudes towards both for the rest of his life. The second event that changed Carafa's life was the Protestant movement, initiated when Martin Luther nailed up the 95 Theses in 1517, when Carafa was 2 years into his 5-year term as papal nuncio to Spain. The aggressive use which the early Protestants made of the printing press in their anti-Catholic propaganda united in his mind and Carafa's mind with his developing mistrust of the humanist movement in general, and prompted a complete change of direction in his life. Carafa returned to Italy in 1520, determined to reform his diocese of Theate. He went to work imposing severe regulation and supervision of his priests and on the monasteries in his territory. This made him despised by many, but it did bring him to the attention of reform-minded Catholics, sincere Catholics among the clergy and laity, who have always existed. And they, during the Renaissance, they were largely pushed into the underground, but they existed, and they knew each other, they networked with each other to do the good that they were able to do in a profoundly malfunctioning situation. Disgusted with the resistance he encountered in reforming, or rather attempting to reform his diocese, and disgusted with himself for having been, as he came to view it, been duped by the Renaissance in his youth, Bishop Carafa made a startling decision in 1524 to resign from his diocese. he was not leaving the priesthood or leaving the church. He did this. He resigned the diocese in order to create something completely new in the church, an order of clerics regular. Okay, now this requires some background. For this purpose, he did not do this alone. So for this purpose, he joined Saint Gaetano, Gaetano. He's also known by the Latin rendering of that name as Saint Cajetan, Cajetan. Not to be confused with the great Dominican Thomas de Vio, who was known as Cardinal Cajetan, but that was for a different reason. That was because Thomas de Vio was born in Gaetano, Italy. So that's, but the Saint Gaetano was actually just named Gaetano. So they're two different people. So if you want to look him up, this Saint Gaetano or Saint Cajetan lived from 1480 to 1547, and his feast day is August 7th. Okay, who was this guy? Saint Gaetano, or Saint Cajetan, was born in Thiene, Italy, on October 6th, 1480, to Gaspar, who was the Don, the Lord of Thiene, and Maria Portia. They were in northern Italy. Thiene was northern Italy, 47 miles west of Venice, 120 miles east of Milan. When Gaetano was age 2, his father died, but left the family financially secure. Influenced by his deeply pious mother, Gaetano chose an ecclesiastical life, rather than being forced into it by his family, which was a characteristic problem we've seen in feudalism. He studied at Padua, received a doctorate in both civil and canon law at the age of 24, after which he was accepted into papal service by Pope Julius II, and immediately assigned to be a canonical advisor and secretary in the diplomatic corps between the Holy See and Venice, since he was from northern Italy. He wasn't from the city of Venice, but he was from northern Italy, and Venice is also in northern Italy. This particular venue of church service was not congenial to Gaetano. It was a lot of paperwork, a lot of negotiation. And as the lawyer, he was the one not only had to do negotiation, but also put the final decisions in written form, and then go back and then, well, okay, then somebody read, or no, we want to change that, and then we want to change that, it's just a negotiation. It was not what this was not what he was thinking of as ecclesiastical service. But he felt committed, because Pope Julius II accepted him into church service, so he was committed. But when Pope Julius II died in 1513, Gaetano felt free of that obligation, so he took the opportunity to return home. Like he had not entered the church to make a living. His family wealth freed him from the need of any employment just to make a living. But he was still a priest, so and he did not want to leave the priesthood or leave the church. It's just that he, doing canonical work and diplomatic work and all that was just not what he had envisioned priestly life being. Because he thought that what he wanted actually mattered. That's adorable. When people think what they want matters in life. But when you're rich, you come from a rich family, and you're not dependent on anyone, then I mean, what you want still doesn't matter. But if you don't get what you want, then you have options that the rest of us, normal humans don't have. That what we want doesn't matter, but we still have to live with it. That whereas a rich person, what they want doesn't matter, but then they don't have to live with it. So, seeking an apostolic direction for his priesthood, in 1522, he established a hospice for incurables in Venice, and he served as chaplain. See, this is something else a rich person can do. Like he had them. He didn't have to go beg or raise money to do this. He just had money. He was an only child, and he had money, and so he just I want to do this, and this is the kind of way I want to be a priest. So he just bought a building, and hired people and turned it into a hospice. And he would be the chaplain. So, when you're rich, you can do these things. So this ministry brought Gaetano into contact with like-minded Catholics who were also interested in that, in the corporal works of mercy. Now, he was not the first one, to think of doing something like this. So, but the fact that he did it, and he did it on his own, that brought him to the attention of the group that did pioneer that sort of institution, a hospice for incurables. This was the Oratory of Divine Love. All right, I know that doesn't sound right in English. So, an oratory, seminarians, the oratory has a specific canonical meaning. So, in the Code of Canon Law, let's see, this is the third year class. I don't know if you've gotten to that in the code yet, but this is in the Code of Canon Law, Canon 1223, defines an oratory as, quote, a place for divine worship designated by permission of the ordinary for the benefit of some community or group of the faithful who gather in it, and to which other members of the faithful can also come with the consent of the competent superior. End quote. So, seminarians, the chapel at Notre Dame Seminary is an oratory. Canonically, that is an oratory. We call a chapel just conventional, but a chapel can be that. Not all chapels are oratories, but some oratories are chapels, and yours is one of them. At the seminary is one of them. So it's a place for divine worship, designated by permission of the ordinary. And look up in the code to see what an ordinary is. In New Orleans, it's the archbishop. So with his permission, for the benefit of some community or group of the faithful. All right. So it's not just a shrine open for everyone. It's for you. It's for the seminarians. It's for your community. However, so it could be the local superior, who is the rector there, or the archbishop, could just close it and say it's only for the seminary. Nobody else can come in, and he'd be completely within his canonical rights to do that. But the code says other members of the faithful can come with the consent of the competent superior. And so that's the case. Well, before COVID, that was the case, that, the seminary chapel could and has been used. Other members of the faithful have been invited. Now, COVID is, but eventually COVID will go away. Well, I shouldn't say that. Maybe, perhaps, someday, eventually, it could take place that COVID will go away, at which point then the oratory could be used that way again. And yours at the seminary is the Oratory of the Immaculate Conception. Anyway, okay, so oratory. So it's a place for a discrete group of the faithful that can be used for others. So these oratories would have a church where they would meet and pray, and then it would be, and then attached to it would be something that their endeavor is. Now, we'll see many oratories in our course. Some their ministry would be schools, some would be hospitals, Some would be hospices, for the incurables, which is not exactly the same thing as a hospital. Some would be orphanages. But it would be attached, just like the Oratory of the Immaculate Conception is part of the seminary. But the seminary is also larger than the oratory. So it would be with these people that the Oratory of Divine Love, it had, the chapel, their prayer place, their sacred place, but their endeavor was larger than that, and their particular endeavor was caring for the incurables. So investigating the origin of this particular oratory allows us to follow a web of connections in the Catholic underground, which brings us back 25 years earlier, to the year 1497, to the northwest Italian port city of Genoa, Genoa, where Columbus was born, by the way. But we're not talking about Columbus today. In 1497, in Genoa, we meet a man named Ettore, Ettore, of the aristocratic house of Vernazza, Vernazza. From his earliest childhood, Ettore wanted to be a priest, but as the eldest son, his family required him to marry and take over the family business, which obediently he did. Yet he never lost his desire for church service. One way he directed his desire was in funding institutions to assist the needy, including hospitals. Through one such endeavor, Ettore met Saint Catherine of Genoa. Saint Catherine, or Caterina, was born in 1447 to another aristocratic house, the House of Fieschi, Fieschi. She was the fifth child of Jacopo and Francesca. The Fieschi family, the house, had a long history of Guelph loyalty to the church, produced 72 cardinals in its history, and 2 popes. Pope Innocent IV, elected in 1243, and Pope Hadrian V, elected in 1276. Caterina's older sister, Limbania, was sent. The family just decided to send her into a convent of Augustinian nuns. Catherine wished to join her, but her family instead decided that she would marry. Accordingly, in 1463, at age 16, she wed Giuliano Adorno, of another noble Genoese family. Obedience to her family brought Caterina a life of torture. Her husband proved to be adulterous, abusive, and wasteful, trapping Caterina in a nightmare that today would be described as domestic violence. They had no children, as Giuliano dissipated his amorous attentions outside of the marriage. Caterina sought consolation in prayer, daily communion, daily mass, and unpaid service to the sick in a local hospital, the Panettone Hospital, which was the oldest hospital in Genoa. There, she met the chaplain of the hospital, Father Marabatti. He became her spiritual director. When her husband died in 1497, after squandering all the family resources on gambling, Caterina moved into the hospital, where she had to take employment to survive, because her husband left her nothing. So she became treasurer and manager of the hospital, sort of like the superintendent, the director. Father Marabatti introduced her to one of the hospital's patrons, Ettore Vernazza, whom we just met. Impressed with her, Ettore asked her, Caterina, to become godmother to his newborn daughter, born in that same year, 1497, baptized Thomasina of the House of Vernazza. And we're going to meet her again. She's going to become a nun, but then in religion take a different name, Sister Battistina. Ettore then organized and systematized his charitable endeavors. And he was a very good businessman, so he had money to spend on it. In the same year, 1497, he created the Compagnia del Mendiletto. It was a society, a lay society to collect alms, to support the hospital, as well as pay for treatment for those who could not afford a hospital. Remember, there's no health insurance in the 15th century. Benefiting from St. Catherine of Genoa's practical insights as Caterina's insights as a hospital manager, Ettore was soon joined by other like-minded lay Catholics. Giovanni Selvaggio, Niccolo Grimaldi, who's an ancestor of the current the ruling house of Monaco, is the House of Grimaldi. So Prince Rainier of Monaco, who married Grace Kelly, and their child, their Prince Albert, I guess he's the one ruling now. Anyway, they're descended from this guy, Niccolo Grimaldi, and another Benedetto Lomellino. Together, they discovered a substantial number of the sick, both those with some material means as well as those without, who were simply never going to recover. But they also were not, going to drop dead any minute. And they also had no one to care for them on a long-term basis. Even the best-funded hospitals had limited space. So St. Catherine of Genoa suggested to them that they start a supplemental ministry, which Ettore, Giovanni, Niccolo, and Benedetto agreed to fund. Father Marabati, the chaplain of the hospital, approached the newly appointed Archbishop of Genoa, Giovanni Sforza, securing canonical recognition of the Oratory of Divine Love in 1499, which funded the first hospital for the incurables, so I suppose today we call it a hospice. The Societas Reductus Incurabilium. It was the first of its kind in Italy. Caterina, St. Catherine of Genoa, died in the not at that hospital, but in the one where she worked, the Panettone Hospital. She died on September 15th, 1510. But the ministry she inspired continued. Genoa was a vibrant port city, and Ettore was a commercial notary, a very successful one, daily interacting with merchants from across the Mediterranean, the Adriatic, and the Aegean seas. Word of his ministry spread in this way, and he knew who to talk to. I mean, he knew the regulars that came through who were faithful Catholics, practicing Catholics. So through that's the network. That's the Catholic network. Through that network, word of his ministry spread until lay Catholic merchants from Rome, who did business with Genoa, decided to replicate that ministry to serve the same needs in their own city of Rome. So in 1512, the Oratory of Divine Love opened a branch in the Trastevere district of Rome, using the Church of St. Sylvester as their oratory. Here, St. Gaetano re-enters the story. As we've seen, bored to despair with his diplomatic duties in service to Pope Julius II, he sought spiritual edification through some pastoral ministry. Now, he had a full-time it was occupied full time, so he was kind of limited. But through word of mouth, he heard of this new endeavor, the oratory, using St. Sylvester Church. So he instantly tracked it down, and he offered service in his spare time. The following year, 1513, his patron, Pope Julius II, died. As we've seen, Gaetano's wealth, was intact, family wealth was intact, so, he didn't need to work to make a living. And he regarded his commitment to Rome at an end with the death of his patron. So Gaetano resolved to do what the Roman merchants had done, imitating Genoa. He resolved that he would go home and he would bring the Oratory of Divine Love back to his home, a ministry to the incurables. The next year, Pope Leo X gave papal recognition to the Trastevere Oratory of Divine Love on March 24th, 1514. At that time, the Oratory of Divine Love consisted of 36 laymen and 4 priests, one of whom was Saint Gaetano. The rule prescribed for this oratory, there was a fixed program of prayers that the members were supposed to say. They would have a weekly fast. They would all fast on the same day. They went to confession once a month. They went to communion as a group 4 times a year. And their ministry focused on the corporal works of mercy, caring for orphans, food and clothes distribution to the poor, bringing food and visiting the imprisoned, and of course the originating thing is tending to the sick. 2 years later, in 1516, Caterina, Saint Catherine of Genoa's goddaughter, Ittore's daughter, Thomasina, expressed her desire for religious life. Ettore did not take that away from her, as his own father had taken priesthood away from him. So she entered the Augustinian convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie, Our Lady of Grace, in Genoa. In religion, as a nun, she took the name Sister Battistina Vernazza. Over the course of her life, she served as treasurer, novice mistress, and prioress of the convent, but she stayed there the rest of her life. But it was not a contemplative cloister, so she was free to correspond, and she did. She had a penchant for writing, and she maintained an extensive correspondence, with and so, again, the network, the Catholic network. She later wrote a book about her godmother's life, St. Catherine of Genoa, which is where I'm getting all this stuff from. The reason I can't elaborate, I've often referred to the Catholic network, but I can't always go into it because the sources just haven't survived. So in this case we do, so that's why I'm spending so much time on it. But just know, in every generation this exists. So as vile and revolting and putrid as society becomes in every age, no matter how low it gets, the faith survives. And it's because of people like this. Most of them are forgotten, but once in a while, somebody like Sister Battistina had a penchant for writing, and the writing survives, so we get to know about them. Most don't, but they still do good. They still do the right act, and that's it does us good to remember that. Satan never sleeps, but neither does the Holy Spirit. Okay, so she wrote a book about her godmother's life, St. Catherine of Genoa, titled Book of the Marvelous Life and Holy Teachings of Blessed Catherine of Genoa. From that, she collected Catherine's writings. So from that was extracted 2 other works of Catherine of Genoa's, which sometimes are published separately. These are Catherine's the Dialogue of the Soul and Body and her Treatise on Purgatory. Those writings provided inspiration for centuries of Catholics, including 2 that we will meet in future sessions, St. Robert Bellarmine and St. Francis de Sales. Meanwhile, St. Gaetano's plans were delayed by his own mother's illness. He wanted to bring the Oratory of Divine Love back home. But his mother got sick, and it proved to be a protracted, very difficult illness. He devoted himself to care for her until her death in 1522. At that point, he picked up his plans by establishing a hospice for incurables in Vicenza and a second one in Venice. Now, being a priest, as distinct from the founders of the oratory like Ettore, who were mostly laymen who did have to work for a living. I mean, they were wealthy, but they had to work. Like Ettore, he had to continue to work to make money, and then he used some of that money to fund charity, but he couldn't just stop working. Whereas Gaetano was a priest, so he wanted, in his version of the oratory, he wanted to combine the spirit of monasticism with the full-time exercise of active pastoral ministry. Now, that's something that that the laity who have to work for a living, they can't do that full time, but a priest, that's kind of what priesthood is. It's doing this full time. So all of this is what returns us at this point. Bishop Carafa, who became Pope Paul IV, enters the story. 2 years earlier, in 1520, the future pope, still Bishop Carafa of Chieti in Abruzzo, which is 124 miles northeast of Rome, he returned to his diocese, but had been away for 5 years, traveling on papal diplomatic missions, as we said, to Flanders and Spain. Those assignments had been profoundly disturbing to Carafa, exposing him to the most virulent anti-Catholicism of the Dutch Calvinists, as well as the highly politicized Catholicism of the Spanish royal court, entirely shaped by the conventions of feudalism and the belligerent colonialism of that period of Spanish history. Carafa returned home, determined to reform his diocese in accord with traditional scholasticism, devotionalism, and asceticism, none of which were welcomed by those who most needed it. But word of his efforts spread to interested Catholics, some of whom were part of the extensive correspondence network maintained by Ettore's daughter, St. Catherine of Genoa's goddaughter, Sister Battestina Vernassa. Through her network, people wrote to her about St. Gaetano and Bishop Carafa. She wrote back, got their contact information. She wrote to them separately. Then they responded. Then she wrote to them about each other. They responded. And so then through letters, this is a lady, she never left but it's just the way these things happen. Like she never actually met these guys, but because of the correspondence, like they only met because of her through the letters. Anyway, that's history's made. Well, I should say she had met St. Gaetano, but not Carafa. Anyway, so that's and they wrote then in this way they wrote to each other, and then they decided to meet, and that changed both of their lives. And this catches us up to the startling decision, but now it can make more sense, of Bishop Carafa resigning his see, resigning as a bishop, in order to form this new thing called this clerics regular. Well, Pope Clement VII was the vicar, was the pope at the time. He allowed Carafa to resign in order to establish this new community with St. Gaetano. In 1524, Pope Clement gave papal he gave permission. The actual constitutions would come later, but gave permission, and they call this officially the Congregation of Clerics Regular of the Divine Providence, conventionally abbreviated as the Theatines, after the Latin form of the city of Chieti, which was Theate. So Theatines, Theate. Theate is the Latin form of Chieti. Then the Theatines, or the TH E-A-T-I-N-E-S. The founders numbered 4: Gaetano and Carafa, whom we've already met, along with 2 other guys, Paolo Consigliere and Bonifacio de Colle. Since personal suffering and ministry to others who were suffering provided commonality among them, Gaetano consecrated them to the cross. That became their emblem. The official establishment took place on what the calendar at the time was the Feast of the Finding of the Holy Cross on May 3rd, 1524. Clement granted papal approval on June 24th of that year, and 3 months later, on September 14th, the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross, the 4 companions made a solemn profession before the papal altar of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Now, since Carafa had resigned his diocese, another bishop had to do this, and he was one of them taking the vows. So another bishop, the Bishop of Caserta, Giovanni Bonziano, who was received their profession. The 4 elected Carafa as the first superior and author of the order's constitutions. So Gaetano, even though he had a doctorate in civil and canon law, he had already learned that he had absolutely no interest in administration or paperwork. So they elected Carafa to do that, and he accepted. The Theatine charism was to recall the clergy to a life of holiness and the laity to the practice of virtue. And we've already covered the many temptations drawing both groups away from that, problems presented by feudalism as well as the Renaissance. The Theatines founded oratories and hospitals, devoted themselves to preaching the gospel, since they were priests, and they practiced extreme austerity. The particular ecclesial construct of the Theatines, this clerics regular, was an innovation in church history. This was the first group of clerics regular, and that requires some explanation because it was intentional. At the time, there were several forms of ecclesiastical service available for baptized Catholics who wished to do that. First were the secular clergy, what we would call today the diocesan clergy. So secular that just means the world. So the clergy whose work is in the world, as distinct from those who were in a monastery, and we'll see the other. But anyway, so this is what we call diocesan clergy or hierarchical clergy, that they were the clergy of a particular diocese. Now, the clerics at the time, this consisted of those in both minor and major orders. So they were not all priests, but those who were tonsured. So once you were tonsured, you were admitted to the clerical state, and you were a secular cleric if you were tonsured for a diocese. And then you serve in the 4 minor orders, and then the first major order was subdeacon, then deacon, then priest. And the highest of the major order was bishop. So obviously, not everybody did that. But anyway, that's the life. And this was the group, the diocesan clergy, was the group that Carafa and Gaetano most wanted to reform, because parish clergy have the most frequent contact with the laity and were therefore in a position to do either the most good or the most harm. From his experience doing visitations as a bishop, Carafa saw a clear pattern. He felt that the single most detrimental reality to the to authenticity of life among secular clergy, diocesan clergy, was isolation in parishes. Now, this was long before psychology, so he observed this in spiritual terms, that a man who is isolated for too long loses, or can lose, except those who have extraordinary personal discipline, can lose the structured life necessary to maintain regular prayer. And without regular prayer, a man who has dedicated himself to ecclesiastical service becomes disconnected from the reason for his ordination, the telos, the end of his ordination. Without that sense of purpose, he can reach out in desperation, and those are desperate. You know, take the easiest solace available, which, because of the nature of sin appears to be the easier way. So finding solace in sin appears to be the easiest solution. And the common sins he observed were intemperance, as they would have called it. That's, drunkenness or alcoholism, or concubinage, as we've seen, those who have mistresses. Second, secular canons, or canons regular. Now, we've already encountered these as far back as the medieval course with the rule of St. Chrodegang. These were priests attached to a cathedral, living in community according to a rule. Hence, regular. Regular means rule. Their primary apostolate was serving the cathedral liturgically, and then because they were living there, they also could, typically would also serve as in the chancery of the bishop. This form of ecclesiastical service was also open to women, though of course they lived in differentiated communities. They would not receive holy orders, but there could be canons, of women who attached to these cathedrals, and they would participate in the divine office, publicly, and do other forms of service, primarily services of prayer. But of course, they did not receive holy orders. For the canons regular, their normal contact with the laity would be in the form of the divine office, which they celebrated at the appropriate times in public in the cathedral and the choir stalls. From his experience as a bishop, Carafa saw the benefit of this mode of life was the structured prayer that, 8 times a day you go into church and you pray publicly, which also provides a ministry, because the church was open so that members of the faithful could go and listen and participate. But he saw the disadvantage, being that the canons quickly became totally absorbed in the life of the cathedral chapter, which had the natural correlative effect of separating them or causing them to lose touch with outside, with what was going on outside of their little world. Now, seeing what the great cathedrals of Europe were, as many have survived, it's easy to understand how liturgical service in such a place could quickly become all-consuming. Now, such a life was a form of service to the church, and therefore good in itself. But Carafa was looking for something different. Third, religious orders, or regular clergy. These were, not all religious were clergy. All right, so that's why I make that. So the religious orders were those, in general, were those whose lives were shaped by a particular rule. Latin regula for rule, so those who live by a rule. Hence their frequent designation as regulars. Now, this form of ecclesiastical service was also open to both men and women in differentiated communities. But what must be understood about this group, the religious or the regulars, is that their primary vocation was not to priesthood. Their primary vocation was to live according to their rule, to their whatever their particular charism of their order was. Now, some of them did become priests, but that was only if it served the interest of the order. So if a member of a religious order received ordination as a priest, then he would be considered a regular clergy, a cleric who lives according to the rule of a religious order. But not all religious were clerics. As many just spend their lives as brothers or as nuns. Carafa's encounter with this category of ecclesiastical service was most often through the famous orders that we've met: the Dominicans, Franciscans, Augustinians, Benedictines. And they did all accomplish much good for the church since they came into being. He approved of the structure given to their lives by their rule, and the purpose, the sense of purpose of their particular ministry, what we would call the charism. He also recognized that their scholarship, united with faith, was absolutely essential in combating the emerging protest movement, the Protestant movement. Yet he saw a dark side to them also. He believed that by their nature, the religious orders and members of religious orders put the interest of their order above all else, even the interest of the larger church. As a bishop, he was continually frustrated by their resistance to him, to his authority as bishop, and he concluded that all too often they used their rule and their constitutions as a shield for what was really nothing more than disobedience, self-serving disobedience. This attitude was confirmed in his own mind by the fact that Martin Luther was an Augustinian, was a member of a religious order, shaped by his formation and Carafa's view to be disobedient to bishops and popes. Now, that's not entirely fair. I mean, we spent a lot of time on Luther, so I won't repeat all that, but you have that in your notes. So Carafa's criticism here is a little oversimplified. But anyway, that's the way he saw it. So that's that. Fourth, monastic orders. These were religious orders, as mentioned above, but bound to a rule first, with priesthood accepted only if it served the needs of the order. But they added to this bond. They added to this a bond of stability to a particular place. This form of service was also open to both men and women in separate communities, but they could be in the same order, like the Benedictines or the Cistercians, Carmelites. Now, Carafa, in his calmer moments, recognized the priceless gift that the monastic orders, especially the Benedictines, had given to the church. In the early Middle Ages, when literacy and government virtually disappeared in Europe, they kept learning alive and provided islands of stability and holiness in a disintegrating world. When Europe began to rebuild after the fall of the Roman Empire, it was able to do so within the context of Christianity, largely because of what the monasteries had preserved. Yet, in Carafa's more angry moments, he felt that the monastic orders also combined the worst of all the other categories of church incorporation: the isolation of unnaturally prolonged silence, myopic focus on a particular place, in their case the monastery, and the self-serving disobedience to the hierarchy of the religious orders, like the mendicants mentioned earlier. So the solution of Carafa and Gaetano was to attempt a synthesis of all the best of those previous mentioned into something new. And that is, fifth category, which is still with us, the clerics regular. These would be ordained priests living in community according to a rule, under the authority of their local bishop, and then, of course, ultimately the Pope, hoping thereby to insulate themselves from the temptations of isolation, of myopia, and self-serving disobedience. The Theatine rule was exceptionally severe, but their example of simple virtuous living, their presence in parishes, as well as prison and hospital ministry, gained them a small but steady stream of vocations. This was the first such institute of clerics regular. As we'll see, there were others that followed this model, the Jesuits being the most famous. But we'll get to that in a minute. So, 1524, the Theatines were approved by Pope Clement VII. The plans of Carafa and Gaetano suffered a major setback. And years of effort, years went into this. And then, this is another life lesson. It so often happens that, that years or decades of effort and labor and thought and sacrifice, planning, go into the pursuit of a dream. And then, poof, it's ripped away by forces completely beyond your control. And that can present a real spiritual crisis. So all the years, the decades spent on that, was it a waste? Did it do any good? It's all gone. Just poof. It's ripped away. Just sucking this like the vampire bat, or the vampire, just sucking the blood out of the carotid, and just draining till there's nothing but the husk left. Think of that in spiritual terms. Right? In their case, Carafa and Gaetano's case, the setback was owing to the predictable manifestation of demonic attack on all efforts seeking to benefit the church. Which brings us back to, if you recall, we covered in great detail, 1527. Only 3 years after the Theatines came into existence, the city of Rome was sacked by the mercenary army in service to the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. Now, we went into great detail over that, so I won't repeat it all, but you should have it in your notes. And if you don't, just go back to the playlist on my channel. It's the reign of Pope Clement VII. Now, the Theatines were in Rome at the time, and they were new, so and they only had 12 Theatines. They had 4 initially. 3 years later, they were up to 12. Now, owing to their originating ministry being with the sick and the hospitalized, they naturally remained in Rome when it was attacked to serve the injured rather than seek escape. Inevitably, they were captured by mercenaries and tortured to reveal the location of their hidden gold. Now, of course, no such treasure existed. People that just think, oh, yeah, the papal treasure, like if it's like we just have these chests of gold just hanging out. Whereas the reality is we're shutting down parishes and schools, and we can barely pay the insurance, and yet, the papal treasure. Yeah. All right, it's getting late. That's why my brain is drifting. Well, so they tortured him, and then when they finally tortured him enough to where they believed him that they really did not have chest of gold hidden somewhere, then they tortured them some more to punish them for not having chest of gold for that to be stolen. In a malign coincidence that did much harm to the later Pope Paul IV's pontificate, these mercenaries torturing him when he was still just the former Bishop Carafa were Spanish mercenaries. And that fueled his existing ethnic hatred and predisposition against them to the point of a pathology. It really, hyperbole aside, it became just a completely unreasoning hatred of them. Although, I shouldn't say unreasoning. If somebody, just tortures you and tortures you and tortures you for something that you don't even have and you can't possibly give them, well, that is going to it's going to adjust your view of such people. After Charles V, as we covered how this was all resolved, that Charles did not order it, but ultimately he was responsible, and that he had to buy them off. He had to buy off his own army to get them to leave Rome. So after that happened, the surviving Theatines made their way to Venice, and where Gaetano, he was one of them, so he went with them to Venice, and there they met Saint Jerome Emiliani. Saint Jerome Emiliani, that's Emiliani, was born 1486 in Venice. His father's name was Angelo Emiliani. His mother's name was Eleonora. At the age of 15, Jerome ran away from home to join the army. He participated in wars for his home of Venice. Remember, Italy's not a unified country, so like Venice was his country. Fighting for Venice against other city-states, against the Papal States, against France, against the Habsburgs, and the kaleidoscope of carnage that afflicted Italy throughout the period. In 1508, in the course of one of these conflicts, he was captured, and he suffered all the indignities that are inflicted on prisoners of war. So you don't need me to explain what that means. Now, as he had been at the time he was captured, he was governor defending Treviso for the Venetians. So he was going to be executed as a message for the Venetians. They were going to kill him, chop off his head, and then use a catapult to catapult the head into the, it's a terror tactic. And he was told this was going to happen. So he prayed to Our Lady, and he made a pilgrimage vow that if he was spared. Now, as it happened, on early in the day before the deed was going to be done, a brawl erupted among the enemy soldiers holding him prisoner that had nothing to do with him. They were all mercenaries, so they were just fighting. But it provided him an opening to escape, which he took. After which, he fulfilled his vow. He made a pilgrimage to a shrine of Our Lady at Treviso. And his chains, he still had the chains that he was bound with. He left the chains there as well as a substantial offering in gratitude. Then he went back to his duties. He was appointed podesta, which is like a mayor, but of a city, but not elected the way our mayors are. It was appointed, so it was a city magistrate of Castelnuovo de Caro, which was another Venetian holding. His life then changed when his nephews were orphaned and left in his care. Now, through their eyes, he learned of the plight of other orphans, and many of those orphans did not have other relatives like him, other family members who were willing to take them in. The need he saw in them that triggered the memory, the helplessness, the fear that he experienced as a prisoner of war awaiting execution for no crime other than honorably serving his city. Now, okay, so he sees that triggers the memory. He wants to help. Well, how do you help? Well, he had no experience in life other than military, so that's how they'll help him in that way. He rented a house near the Church of St. Rose, and he created sort of a barracks situation for orphan boys. Jerome, along with a few other army buddies who were not married but had similar religious inclinations, lived in the house. They cared for the boys, so the orphan boys, they had food and shelter, and then the men either personally taught them or secured apprenticeships for them until they were old enough to enter the trades, enter the church, enlist in the army, or go to sea. They were in Venetian territory, which was a maritime power. So the group at this house, the St. Rose house, became acquainted with two local priests, Alessandro Basuzio and Agostino Bariso. They provided sacraments and religious instruction, and they guided those boys who wished to enter into ecclesiastical service. This, guided them in the appropriate way to do that. In the course of this work, St. Jerome became aware of the hospice for incurables in Venice established by St. Gaetano. So here, in 1528, we have another connection in the web was tied. In 1528, Gaetano, Carafa, and the surviving Theatines, who endured torture and captivity during the sack of Rome, by 1528 they made their way to Venice and stayed at the hospital themselves to convalesce. So Jerome heard about them. He met them, got to know them, and he was inspired listening to their story, just listening to the work that they did before the sack of Rome, and he could well identify with what they endured during the sack of Rome as prisoners being tortured, because he also had been a prisoner of war. So they became friends. With St. Gaetano's advice and guidance, Jerome established the Company of the Servants of the Poor in the following year, 1529. Their goal was to care for the orphans and abandoned youth, according to the instructions of the bishop. Jerome placed their base in the village of Somascha. That's Somascha, located between Milan and Bergamo, overlooking the southeastern branch of Lake Como, which is beautiful, stunning scenery. Jerome and the original 6 members expanded by establishing orphanages in Brescia, Bergamo, Milan, and Verona. In 1532, again following the guidance, the advice of St. Gaetano, they imitated the structure of the Theatines. Excuse me. Let's see what new horror this is. Okay. Sorry about that. That was I'll spare you. Okay. 1529. 1532. St. Jerome Emiliani and companions imitated the structure of the Theatines by forming the Order of Clerics Regular from Somascha. St. Gaetano relocated. He was there with Jerome in Venice, but then continuing his work with the Theatines, he relocated to Venice the next year, 1533, where he started reviving the Theatines, post-sack of Rome, by establishing a new house, which was followed by other houses. And Carafa remained with him, rebuilding the Theatines, and would have been perfectly content to do that for the rest of his life. However, what we want, you see, he learned more than once. What we actually want it means absolutely nothing. In December of 1536, Pope Paul III recalled him into papal service in preparation for the Church Council, originally planned, as we covered earlier, to meet in Mantua, but eventually opened in Trent. To this end, Pope Paul appointed Carafa to the College of Cardinals. St. Jerome Emiliani died at Somascha 4 years later, on February 8th, 1537, while ministering to plague victims. The order was approved, that received papal recognition, so it came together as a diocesan congregation at Somascha in 1532, and it was approved by Pope Paul III in 1540. So that the Somascha, they were the second of the orders of the clerics regular. The same year, 1540, the same Pope, Paul III, approved the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, which also adopted the Theatine paradigm of clerics regular. So the Jesuits were the third of the clerics regular. Now, St. Ignatius, whom we've already met, sought to achieve the good of Carafa's Theatines, but attenuated the severity, because Ignatius believed that excessive harshness would limit its effectiveness. Carafa initially wanted Ignatius and the first Jesuits, whom we've met already. Initially, he wanted them to just simply join the Theatines, because it appeared to him that Ignatius wanted to do exactly the same kind of things that Carafa wanted to do. However, Ignatius resisted this successfully and instead formed a different cleric, society of clerics regular. He felt that such a merger, that joining the Theatines, would consign his society to oblivion. And Carafa, for the rest of his life, despised St. Ignatius, suddenly remembering that Ignatius was born in Spain, and he hated Spain, although Ignatius was ethnically Basque. It's interesting that both men proved to be somewhat right. The Theatines never did make the historic impact that the Jesuits did. Yet the Jesuits have often been, in their history, accused of self-serving disobedience. 2 years later, 1542, Carafa, now Cardinal Carafa, persuaded the Pope to activate the Roman Inquisition, modeled on the Spanish Inquisition, with himself, Carafa, as one of the Inquisitors General. In this role, Carafa earned a fearsome reputation for severity. Perhaps in modern terms, we could see him as afflicted with PTSD. After his own experience of captivity and torture during the sack of Rome. Now, Carafa was no longer able to devote himself exclusively to the Theatines, but he did use his position as cardinal to facilitate Gaetano opening a Theatine house in his beloved Naples. Gaetano died there in Naples on August 7th, 1547, a decade after St. Jerome died at Somacia. Gaetano's remains, where Carafa saw that they were reposed in the church of St. Paolo Maggiore in Naples, which is located on a piazza that's still named for Gaetano. It's the Piazza San Gaetano. St. Jerome Emiliani was canonized in 1767. He's a patron saint of orphans and abandoned children. You just gotta laugh, okay, excuse me. So, I'm gonna have to stop. Nowhere near finished, but so we'll have to do Pope Paul in 2 segments, because this is something I have to do. This is for job number 2. I think I have to do this for. The videos are for job number 3. Yeah, I think it's job number 3. But now I have to stop and go do job number 2. So anyway, now I don't know how to stop, shut down the computer, and then another day start recording the same video. So what I have to do is going to be long enough. I just have to close down the computer. So I'm going to shut this down, and I'll call this Pope 223A or something, and then whenever I get to do the next one, I'll just call it B. So you'll be able to follow it in sequence, because you really do need to follow it in sequence. All right. So for the moment, we'll pause here, and you just take this as a life lesson. That life really does suck. It does. And there's nothing we can do about it. If we don't like it, it's still going to suck. So, all right. One endures. Anyway, thank you for your attention. For the moment, this session is adjourned.